So the bear says, "I don't know, I'm just a bear." An ordinary office worker is trying to tell a lame joke to cheer up her sick friend in the hospital. But when she looks up, the man in the bed isn't her friend. He's a stranger with an icy gaze and a terrifyingly powerful aura. She expects to be thrown out in embarrassment, but instead, he makes the strangest request she has ever heard. A transaction that has nothing to do with money. What was that request? Sounds interesting, right? But wait, before I tell you more, drop a quick comment and let me know where you're listening to this story from. Isaac lay on the crisp white sheets of his private hospital room, the kind reserved for those who could afford silence in a world of beeps and bustle. At 32, he was no stranger to pressure, but this collapse had caught him off guard. A sharp, unrelenting pain in his stomach that his doctors chalked up to stress, though he knew it ran deeper. He'd just ended a call with his VP, his voice slicing through the line like a blade, demanding updates on the latest cybersecurity breach. "Fix it or find someone who can," he'd snapped before hanging up. Now the room felt too quiet, too sterile, amplifying the hollow ache inside him. The door swung open without a knock, jolting him from his thoughts. In walked a young woman, mid-20s, with a basket of oranges dangling from her arm. She was humming softly, her steps light and unhurried, as if she owned the place. Emma George didn't notice at first. She was lost in her own world, finishing a joke she'd been practicing for her friend down the hall. And then the bear says, "I don't know, I'm just a bear." She laughed out loud, shaking her head at how lame it sounded. But hey, anything to brighten a sick day. She looked up, expecting to see her friend's familiar face, but instead met the steely gaze of a stranger. A man with sharp features, dark hair tousled just enough to look effortlessly commanding, even in a hospital gown. His eyes narrowed, assessing her like an intruder in his domain. Isaac's irritation flared. Who was this? Some volunteer with a misguided sense of cheer? But as she froze, basket in hand, he couldn't help but notice her poise. No fumbling apology, just a quick scan of the room, realizing her mistake. "Oh," Emma said, her voice steady, a hint of amusement creeping in despite the mix-up. "Wrong room. These places all look the same, don't they? Like a maze designed by someone with a grudge against visitors." Isaac propped himself up slightly, his mind racing for a retort. People didn't just barge into his space. They scheduled meetings, sent emails. Yet here she was, unflinching. "Am I the bear in your story?" he asked, his tone dry, laced with sarcasm that usually sent assistants scurrying. Emma tilted her head, a spark of wit lighting her eyes. She could have bolted, but something in his expression, that mix of annoyance and underlying exhaustion, held her. "If you are, you're a very well-dressed one." "Sorry about that. But if you're in the market for bad jokes, I've got a whole arsenal. Helps pass the time in these fluorescent-lit prisons." Their exchange was brief, a verbal sparring that caught Isaac off guard. She didn't cower or fawn. Instead, she matched his sharpness with a gentle deflection, turning his jab into something almost playful. He found himself smirking, a rare crack in his armor. Who talks like that to a complete stranger? Especially one like him, radiating authority even from a bed. Emma felt a flicker of curiosity, too. The man looked like he carried the weight of empires. But there was a loneliness in his eyes, hidden behind that icy front. She offered a quick smile, genuine and warm, before backing toward the door. "Anyway, hope you feel better soon. And if you need a laugh, just holler, though I doubt that's your style." As the door clicked shut behind her, Isaac sank back into the pillows, the room feeling emptier than before. That brief intrusion had stirred something. A ripple in his carefully controlled world. Who was she? And why did her easy confidence linger like a question he couldn't quite dismiss? For the first time in ages, he felt a spark of intrigue, not from a deal or a threat, but from a simple, unexpected encounter. The hospital room fell silent after Emma's departure, the air heavy with a stillness that seemed to mock Isaac McCall's carefully curated life. The faint hum of medical equipment was the only sound, a sterile reminder of where he was, trapped in a bed, his body rebelling against him. Isaac was a name that echoed through boardrooms, a cybersecurity genius who'd built an empire from nothing but code and relentless will. His wealth could buy anything: private jets, penthouses, loyalty. But it couldn't buy peace. The sharp pain in his stomach wasn't just a medical footnote. It was a scream from a part of him he'd long ignored. He stared at the blank ceiling, the pristine white blurring as his mind drifted back. Growing up, his father, Richard McCall, had been a towering shadow, demanding, unyielding, shaping Isaac into a machine of ambition after his mother's death stole warmth from their home. Love was a luxury, replaced by expectations. Every achievement, every billion added to his name, was a brick in a wall that kept others out and his loneliness in. Friends? None real. Relationships? Transactions. His life was a fortress, impenetrable but hollow. And the collapse that landed him here wasn't just physical. It was the weight of years spent running from that truth. Isaac shifted, wincing as the pain flared. Emma's brief intrusion lingered in his mind, her easy laugh, her refusal to shrink under his glare. She was a stranger, yet her presence had cracked something open, a fleeting glimpse of a world where people didn't measure each other by power or profit. He wondered what it would be like to live in that world, even for a moment. The thought unsettled him, stirring a restlessness he couldn't name. He was Isaac McCall, master of his universe. Yet here he was, alone, grappling with a quiet so loud it drowned out everything else. Emma George stepped out of Isaac's hospital room, the basket of oranges swinging lightly at her side. At 25, she carried herself with a quiet strength that didn't shout but glowed, like sunlight breaking through a cloudy day. Orphaned young after a car accident stole her parents, she'd been raised by her grandmother, whose warm hands and fierce love taught her to stand tall no matter the odds. Emma wasn't rich, but she had a gift for finding joy in small things: a shared laugh, a kind word, a perfectly ripe orange. Today, she was here to visit her friend Sarah, whose hospital bed was a few doors down, hoping to coax a smile with her clumsy jokes. As she walked, Emma's mind lingered on the man she'd just met. His sharp edges and cold stare hadn't rattled her, but something in his eyes, a flicker of loneliness, had. She shook it off, chuckling at her own mistake. Barging into a stranger's room with a bear joke? Classic Emma. Yet that brief encounter sparked a warmth in her chest, a curiosity about the man who seemed so guarded, so alone. Her life was simple, stitched together with resilience and small acts of care. And somehow, that simplicity felt like a shield, one strong enough to face even the iciest of strangers. The hospital corridor buzzed faintly with the rhythm of nurses' footsteps and distant monitors, but for Isaac McCall, the world had narrowed to a single moment. Emma's brief visit had left a crack in his defenses, her easy warmth lingering like a melody he couldn't shake. He lay in the sterile room, the weight of his loneliness heavier than ever, pressing against the ache in his chest. For years he'd built walls with wealth and control, but her uncalculated kindness, a stranger's laugh, a basket of oranges, had slipped right through. It stirred something unfamiliar, a longing he hadn't dared name. As evening shadows crept across the room, Emma passed by his door again, her silhouette a fleeting glimpse through the small window. She was heading back from her friend's room, her steps lighter now, a soft hum on her lips. Isaac's heart thudded, an impulse rising he couldn't ignore. He called out, his voice softer than he intended, almost a plea. "Hey, wait." She paused, turning with that same unflinching gaze, curious but guarded. He didn't offer money or power. Those tools felt useless now. Instead, he asked for something small, something raw. "Come back tomorrow. Tell me another one of those awful jokes." Emma tilted her head, reading the man before her. Beneath his polished exterior, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a man who seemed to carry the world alone. She could have walked away, but something in his voice, earnest, almost desperate, tugged at her. With a small nod, she agreed. A quiet pact was born. For the 2 weeks he'd be stuck in this hospital, she'd stop by each day after visiting her friend, sharing a moment, a story, maybe even a laugh. It wasn't about money or obligation. It was a transaction of something deeper, a shared need for connection neither could yet name. Every day as she left, Isaac felt a spark of something he hadn't in years. Hope tomorrow comes soon. Emma, too, carried a quiet wonder, sensing she'd stumbled into something bigger than a hospital room mix-up. Their worlds, so vastly different, had collided, and in that fleeting agreement, a thread of possibility began to weave itself into existence. The hospital doors slid open, and Emma stepped into the crisp morning air, her sneakers scuffing softly against the pavement. She'd come to say goodbye to Isaac, her unexpected hospital friend, whose sharp wit and guarded eyes had become a strange comfort over the past 2 weeks. Their daily chats, her silly jokes, his reluctant smiles, had woven a fragile thread between them, one she wasn't sure she was ready to cut. But today was his discharge day, and she expected to find him in his room, maybe with a final quip to send her off. Instead, the scene outside stopped her cold. A fleet of sleek black SUVs lined the curb, their polished surfaces glinting under the sun. Men in tailored suits stood like sentinels, earpieces buzzing, while a swarm of reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing like hungry fireflies. At the center of it all was Isaac, no longer the man in a hospital gown trading jabs over bad jokes. He was a vision of power, dark suit crisp, shoulders squared, his face a mask of cool authority as he strode toward a waiting car. The crowd parted for him, their voices a low hum of awe and ambition. Emma's breath caught, her basket of oranges suddenly feeling childish in her hands. She recognized him now, not as her Isaac, but as Isaac McCall, the billionaire cybersecurity mogul plastered across newsstands and TV screens. The man who built empires, whose name carried weight she couldn't fathom. Her stomach twisted, a mix of shock and something sharper, betrayal maybe, or the sting of her own naivety. He'd never mentioned who he was, never hinted at the world he commanded. Those quiet moments in his hospital room, where she'd shared pieces of her simple life, felt like a lie now, a game she hadn't known she was playing. She stood frozen, watching him slide into the car, his expression unreadable, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. The reporters shouted questions about stock prices and mergers, their words a foreign language to her. Emma's mind raced, replaying their conversations, his guarded smiles, the way he'd listened when she talked about her grandmother's garden. Had it all been a charade? A rich man's amusement? She felt small, out of place in this world of power and flash, her own life, a modest apartment, a desk job, a heart full of hard-earned hope, suddenly seeming insignificant. As the convoy pulled away, Emma turned back toward the hospital, her steps heavy. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but a quiet ache settled in her chest. She'd seen a glimpse of something real in Isaac, or so she thought. Now she wondered if she'd been wrong, if the man she'd laughed with was just a shadow of the one driving away, untouchable, unreachable, and utterly out of her world. Back in his glass and steel world, Isaac McCall felt the weight of his empire settle around him like a tailored suit, impeccable, suffocating. The penthouse office with its skyline view and polished mahogany desk should have felt like home. Instead, it was a hollow stage, the hum of his staff's efficiency a stark contrast to the quiet hospital room where Emma's laughter had briefly filled the air. Those 2 weeks of her visits, her quirky stories, her refusal to be intimidated, had left a mark he couldn't shake. Now, free from the hospital's confines, he was adrift, haunted by the absence of something he couldn't name. He decided to find her. It was a reflex, the kind of decisive move that had built his fortune. He dispatched his assistant to track down Emma George, a name that felt oddly intimate on his tongue. Within hours, a sleek package arrived at her modest office, a delicate silver bracelet, its diamonds catching the light like tiny stars, accompanied by an invitation to dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant. Isaac leaned back in his chair, confident this gesture would draw her back, a bridge between their worlds. But Emma was no stranger to standing her ground. When the package arrived, she stared at it, her fingers tracing the velvet box before pushing it away. The gift felt like a transaction, a reminder of the chasm between them. She'd seen Isaac's world outside the hospital. Cars, cameras, control, and it wasn't hers. With a pen and a scrap of paper, she scribbled a note, her words sharp but playful, and sent it back. "Thanks, but I'm not for sale. Try a coffee shop next time. Less caviar, more heart." The courier delivered it to Isaac's desk, and he read it, his jaw tightening, a mix of irritation and intrigue sparking in his chest. No one turned him down. No one. He tried again, this time showing up at her office building himself. No entourage, just a man in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Emma was leaving for the day, her coat slung over one arm, when she spotted him, leaning against a street lamp, looking out of place in her world of crowded sidewalks and flickering neon signs. She didn't stop, just raised an eyebrow as she passed. "Lost your way, billionaire?" she called out, her tone teasing but firm, a challenge wrapped in a smile. Isaac followed, falling into step beside her, his usual authority faltering under her unflinching gaze. He tried to explain the gift, his words clipped, polished, but she cut through them with a laugh that was both warm and cutting. She didn't need his world, she said, didn't want to be a guest in it. Her life, simple, grounded, real, was enough. Yet as they sparred, her wit matching his every step, Isaac felt something shift. Her refusal wasn't rejection. It was defiance, a strength that didn't bend to wealth or power. It drew him in, made him want to know more, to understand this woman who saw through his armor and didn't flinch. Their exchanges grew sharper, each meeting a dance of words, her quick humor against his guarded intensity. Once, at a corner deli where she grabbed her lunch, he tried to buy her coffee, only for her to slide a crumpled dollar across the counter first, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "My treat," she said, leaving him holding a steaming cup he didn't want, his frustration melting into a grudging smile. For the first time, Isaac, the man who controlled everything, felt outmatched, and it thrilled him in a way no boardroom victory ever had. The city buzzed with its usual restless energy, but for Isaac McCall, the world felt sharper, more unsteady, since Emma had walked into and out of his life. Their recent encounters, filled with her quick-witted jabs and his own clumsy attempts to bridge their worlds, had left him rattled, craving something he couldn't quite pin down. He was back in his element now, commanding boardrooms, his tailored suit a shield against vulnerability. Yet the memory of Emma's laugh lingered, a quiet rebellion against the sterile order of his life. He didn't know it, but the walls of his carefully controlled existence were about to crack. Outside Emma's office, a man with a camera lurked in the shadows of a parked van, his lens trained on Isaac as he stood waiting for her the previous evening. The photographer, a wiry figure with a nose for scandal, had caught the billionaire in a rare moment of unguarded humanity, leaning against a lamppost, his face softened by a half-smile as Emma teased him. The image hit the tabloids the next morning. A grainy snapshot splashed across a gossip rag with a headline screaming, "McCall's Mystery Woman. Who's taming the tycoon?" The article speculated wildly, painting Emma as everything from a gold digger to a secret heiress, each word dripping with the kind of intrigue that sold papers. By noon, the photo had reached the desk of Richard McCall, Isaac's father, whose office sat atop the city like a throne. Richard was a man of iron, his gray hair and steely eyes a testament to a life spent wielding power without apology. To him, the McCall name was a fortress, and Isaac's public dalliance with an unknown woman was a chink in its armor. He summoned his son to the top-floor office, the air thick with the scent of leather and old money. The conversation was brief, cutting, delivered in Richard's clipped, commanding tone. Isaac stood rigid, his jaw tight, as his father laid out the stakes. The McCall empire was on the cusp of a monumental merger, one that would cement their legacy. A suitable marriage was part of the plan. A strategic alliance with a woman from their world, not some office worker with a shark tongue and no pedigree. Richard's words were like a blade, slicing through the fragile hope Isaac had been nursing. He warned his son to end this distraction, to protect the family's image, or face consequences that would ripple through their empire. The mention of a fiancé handpicked for Isaac, a woman whose name carried as much weight as their own, felt like a chain tightening around him. As Isaac left the office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him, he felt the weight of his father's expectations heavier than ever. Emma wasn't just a woman he couldn't stop thinking about. She was now a threat to the life he'd been groomed to lead. Meanwhile, Emma went about her day, unaware of the storm brewing in Isaac's world. She sat at her desk, sorting through spreadsheets, her mind drifting to their last exchange. The way Isaac's eyes softened when she'd beat him to paying for coffee. But the whispers of coworkers and a stray glance at a tabloid in the break room brought the photo to her attention. Her face burned as she saw herself labeled a mystery woman. Her simple life dissected for public amusement. The intrusion stung, a reminder of how far Isaac's world was from hers. She pushed the paper away, her heart sinking. Whatever connection they'd started to build now felt fragile, exposed, and dangerously out of her control. Isaac, too, felt the ground shifting. The photo, his father's ultimatum, the looming merger, it all pressed against him, forcing a choice he wasn't ready to make. Yet the thought of Emma, her unyielding spirit and quiet strength, burned brighter than the demands of his empire. For the first time, he wondered if he could defy the path laid out for him, even as the cost of that defiance loomed larger than ever. The evening sun dipped low, painting the narrow streets of Emma's neighborhood in hues of gold and shadow. Isaac McCall, stripped of his usual entourage and sleek cars, stepped out of a cab, his tailored jacket replaced by a simple sweater that felt foreign against his skin. The tabloid photo and his father's icy ultimatum still gnawed at him, but he'd come here to escape the weight of his world, drawn to Emma like a compass finding north. Her address, tracked down through a reluctant coworker, led him to a modest row house, its front yard bursting with the wild, cheerful chaos of a garden. Roses and marigolds tangled together, a testament to care over precision. Emma was there, kneeling in the dirt beside her grandmother, their hands working in quiet rhythm to pull weeds. The older woman's laughter, warm and weathered, carried across the yard as Emma recounted a story about a coworker's coffee spill. Isaac paused at the gate, his usual confidence faltering. This wasn't his boardroom, his stage. Here he was just a man, out of place but inexplicably tethered to the woman whose strength seemed to bloom as naturally as the flowers around her. Emma's grandmother noticed him first, her eyes sharp but kind, taking him in without judgment. She waved him over, mistaking him for a neighbor, and before he could protest, Isaac found himself seated on a weathered porch chair, a glass of iced tea pressed into his hands. The drink was too sweet, the air thick with the scent of soil and honeysuckle, but something about it grounded him. Emma glanced at him, her expression a mix of surprise and wary amusement, but she didn't push him away. Instead, she handed him a pair of gardening gloves, a silent challenge to join their world, if only for a moment. As they worked side by side, the conversation flowed, tentative at first. Isaac, usually so guarded, let slip a story about a childhood summer spent tinkering with computers in his father's cold, silent study, a rare glimpse of the boy he'd been before ambition consumed him. Emma listened, her hands steady in the dirt, her silence inviting rather than judging. She shared a memory of her own, of nights spent with her grandmother, learning to bake bread under a single flickering bulb, their laughter filling the gaps left by loss. The stories weren't grand, but they were real, stitching a quiet connection between them. When her grandmother retreated inside to start dinner, Emma and Isaac stayed in the garden, the dusk settling around them like a soft blanket. He admitted, almost to himself, how heavy his world felt. The endless deals, the expectations, the loneliness masked by power. Emma didn't offer pity. She simply nodded, her eyes reflecting a strength that didn't need to shout. She invited him to stay for dinner, a simple meal of roasted vegetables and homemade bread, served on mismatched plates. As they sat at the small kitchen table, the warmth of the room wrapped around Isaac, softening the edges of his guarded heart. For the first time he felt seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man, flawed and searching. The meal ended with Emma's grandmother insisting he take a slice of pie home, her kindness disarming in its simplicity. As Isaac left, the weight of his father's world felt distant, overshadowed by the quiet glow of this one. Emma watched him go, her heart stirring with a mix of caution and hope. Something had shifted, a bridge built not on wealth or power but on shared moments, fragile and real, that neither could yet name but both felt deeply. The night air wrapped around them like a secret, cool and laced with the faint scent of rain on distant pavement, as Isaac walked Emma to her door. The dinner at her grandmother's had stretched longer than either expected, the simple meal giving way to stories that lingered like echoes, tales of scraped knees and lost dreams, shared over cooling pie. Now, in the quiet of her street, the world felt smaller, more intimate, the hum of city traffic fading into a soft underscore. Isaac's hand brushed hers as they paused under the glow of a single street lamp, its light casting golden halos on the sidewalk cracks. He hadn't planned this moment, hadn't scripted the way his pulse quickened when she turned to face him, her eyes catching the light like polished stones. Emma felt the shift too, a current pulling at the edges of her careful composure. The evening had been a revelation. Isaac out of his armor, laughing at her grandmother's gentle ribbing, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd forgotten the weight he carried. She'd seen glimpses of the man behind the headlines, the one who listened with a hunger that mirrored her own, but doubt flickered in her chest, a whisper of the chasm between their lives, his world of mergers and spotlights, hers of quiet gardens and steady routines. Still, as they stood there, the space between them humming with unspoken words, she didn't pull away. Her breath came shallow, the warmth of his nearness stirring something deep, a longing she'd tucked away after too many losses. Isaac's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The usual steel in his expression softened by a vulnerability he couldn't hide. Those hospital days, the ones that started with her bad jokes and ended with him waiting for her footsteps, had been his first taste of stillness, a peace that wrapped around the chaos in his mind like a forgotten melody. He stepped closer, his voice low, almost lost in the night. The words tumbled out, raw and unpolished. Those moments with her were the first time he'd felt truly at rest, like the empire he'd built couldn't touch him there. Emma's heart stuttered, her own confession rising unbidden. She missed their talks too, the way they cut through the noise of her days, making her feel seen in a way that scared her as much as it thrilled. The air thickened, charged with the kind of tension that builds slow, like thunder on the horizon. Isaac reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek, tentative, as if testing the fragility of the moment. Emma leaned in, her hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath his shirt, a rhythm that matched her own racing pulse. Their lips met then, soft at first, a brush of hesitation that spoke of all the barriers they'd danced around. It deepened, sweet and searching, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, hers curling into his sweater as if to anchor them both. The kiss wasn't fireworks or grand gestures. It was a quiet unraveling, warm lips and shared breath, tasting of pie and possibility, laced with the faint salt of unspoken fears. When they parted, foreheads resting together, the world rushed back in. The distant honk of a car, the rustle of leaves. But it felt distant, muffled. Emma's fingers lingered on his collar, a small smile tugging at her lips, even as a shadow of worry crept in. What now, in the light of day, with his father's empire waiting and her simple life pulling her back? Isaac pulled her closer for a moment, his embrace firm yet gentle, as if he could hold the night forever. In that suspended heartbeat, they were just Isaac and Emma, two souls brushing against the edges of something real, fragile as a first bloom. But the storms on the horizon loomed unseen, ready to test if this spark could weather the gales ahead. For now, though, under that lone street lamp it burned steady, promising more than either dared hope. The coffee shop hummed with the midday rush, the air thick with the scent of fresh brews and toasted pastries, a cozy spot near Emma's office where locals grabbed their fixes amid mismatched chairs and chalkboard menus. Emma slid into a booth, her fingers tracing the edge of a laminated menu, expecting maybe a quick lunch break from the grind of her day. The kiss with Isaac the night before still lingered in her thoughts, a sweet ache that mixed hope with hesitation, making her steps a little lighter despite the tabloid whispers she'd tried to ignore. She didn't notice the older man approaching until he sat across from her, his presence like a sudden shadow over the sunlit table. Richard McCall was a force, even in this unassuming place, his silver hair impeccably combed, his suit a subtle armor of wealth that clashed with the casual chatter around them. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, his eyes sharp, appraising her like a minor glitch in a grand system. Emma's stomach tightened. She recognized him from fleeting glimpses in news clips, the man who'd shaped Isaac into the powerhouse he was. His voice, smooth and measured, cut through the background noise as he introduced himself, though she already knew. This wasn't a chance meeting. It was calculated, a move in a game she hadn't asked to play. He leaned forward slightly, his words weaving a web of condescension wrapped in politeness. He spoke of Isaac's world, the mergers, the legacy, the responsibilities that demanded focus and fitting alliances. Emma was a diversion, he said, a charming sideshow that could derail it all. His tone wasn't loud or threatening. It was worse, laced with a paternal pity that chipped at her core, making her feel small in her simple blouse and jeans. He painted her as out of place, a girl from nowhere who couldn't possibly understand the stakes, her warmth a fleeting novelty that would fade against the demands of power. The check slid across the table then, a crisp envelope with a number inside that could change her life, presented as a kindness, a way out for everyone involved. Emma's hands stayed steady on her coffee cup, but inside a storm brewed, the sting of his words hitting old wounds, the losses that had taught her to stand tall without handouts. She thought of her grandmother's garden, the quiet strength she'd built from scraps, and how this man saw it all as insignificant. The confrontation dragged on, his voice a relentless drip, questioning her motives, her worth in Isaac's orbit. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The implication was clear. She was a temporary thrill, a risk to the empire he'd built. Emma felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mix of anger and hurt, but she held his gaze, her silence a shield. When he finally stood, leaving the envelope like an afterthought, the shop felt colder, the chatter around her distant. She sat there long after he left, the envelope untouched, her coffee growing cold. The encounter had stripped away the glow from last night's kiss, replacing it with a raw ache, the realization that loving Isaac meant stepping into a world that could crush her spirit. Tears pricked her eyes, not from weakness, but from the deep unfairness of it all, the way power twisted even the simplest connections. Yet beneath the pain, a spark of resolve flickered. She wouldn't be bought, wouldn't fade into the background. As she pushed the envelope away and stood to leave, the weight of the moment settled, a turning point that promised storms ahead, but also the quiet fire that had always carried her through. Emma walked out of the coffee shop with her head held high, the envelope left untouched on the table like a discarded napkin. The bustling street blurred around her, the chatter of passers-by fading into a distant hum as the sting of Richard's words sank deeper. She wasn't naive. She'd known Isaac's world was different, but this, being reduced to a distraction, a problem to be paid off, cut like a knife through her carefully built armor. Her steps quickened, carrying her away from the polished cruelty of that encounter, but the wound lingered, a quiet bruise on her self-respect. By the time she reached her apartment, the tears came, hot and unbidden, not from defeat but from the raw injustice of it all. She curled up on her worn couch, the familiar scent of her grandmother's quilt offering little comfort, wondering how something as simple as a connection could unravel so cruelly. Word of the meeting reached Isaac like a punch to the gut, a discreet call from one of his father's aides, meant as a warning perhaps, laid it bare. Richard had gone to Emma, check in hand, to handle the situation. Isaac's office, with its panoramic views and gleaming surfaces, suddenly felt like a cage. He stormed out, leaving meetings unfinished, his driver navigating the city streets in tense silence toward the family estate. The drive was a blur, his mind racing with images of Emma's face, her warm smile from the garden dinner, now twisted by his father's intrusion. How dare he? But beneath the rage a seed of dread took root. This was his world, the one he'd helped build, and now it had lashed out at the one person who'd made him feel alive. The confrontation erupted in Richard's study, a room heavy with leather-bound books and the ghosts of old deals. Isaac burst in, his voice echoing off the walls, demanding answers. Richard stood by the window, unflinching, his expression a mask of calculated calm. The argument escalated, words flying like shards, Isaac accusing his father of overreach, of treating people like assets to be managed. Richard countered coolly, his tone laced with that familiar disdain, reminding Isaac of the empire's fragility, the need for alliances that matched their status. "She's not one of us," he said, the words hanging heavy, a verdict without appeal. Isaac paced, his fists clenched, the room closing in as memories of his mother's absence flashed. How Richard's ambition had left no room for warmth, shaping him into a mirror of that cold drive. Then came the admission, delivered with chilling precision. Yes, he'd offered her money, a clean exit to protect what mattered, the family name, the merger, the power that had always come first. This is our world, Isaac. Power protects power. You can't have both. The words landed like a hammer, shattering the illusions Isaac had clung to. He stopped pacing, the fight draining from him as the truth crashed down. His life, his choices, had paved the way for this hurt. Emma's pain wasn't just his father's doing. It was woven into the fabric of who he'd become. Arrogant, insulated, blind to how his world crushed those outside it. The realization buckled him, a wave of guilt and regret that made his knees weak. He slumped into a chair, the room spinning, his carefully constructed self crumbling like sand. In that moment of collapse, Isaac saw it all. The hollow victories, the loneliness masked by success, the way he'd let power define him. Emma had offered a glimpse of something better, a connection that felt like home, and now his world had tainted it. Tears stung his eyes, rare and unwelcome, as he grappled with his role in this mess. The empire he'd chased felt meaningless, a throne built on isolation. As he left the study, the door closing softly behind him, the weight of change pressed in. Not just anger at his father, but a deep, aching accountability. The man who'd ruled boardrooms now faced his greatest defeat. The loss of his illusions, and the dawning need to rebuild from the ruins. Emma descended into a quiet fortress of her own making, the days stretching like shadows in her small apartment. She changed her phone number without a second thought, blocked every trace of Isaac on her social feeds, and even rerouted her walks to avoid spots where their paths might cross. It wasn't born from bitterness or spite, no, that wasn't her way. It was a shield, forged from the hard lessons of loss, a way to protect the fragile pieces of her heart, and, in a strange twist, to spare him too. She knew deep in her bones that she loved him, that the warmth of their garden talks and that stolen kiss had rooted something real. But love like that could tangle, could hold him back from the empire he'd built, the life his father demanded. She wouldn't be the chain around his ankle, the reason he stumbled. Her inner world churned with pain, sharp and unrelenting, like a thorn embedded too deep to pull out. Nights blurred into one another. Her grandmother's concerned glances met with forced smiles, as Emma reminded herself of the strength she'd grown from orphaned roots. Self-reliance, the quiet American grit that said, "You stand on your own, no matter the ache." She threw herself into routines, stacking files at work with mechanical focus, tending the garden with hands that trembled only when alone. Memories of Isaac surfaced unbidden. His reluctant laugh over pie, the way his eyes softened in the lamplight, each one stung. A reminder of what she'd walked away from, but she held firm, whispering to herself that this was kindness, not cowardice. The distance was her armor, a necessary void to heal, even as it hollowed her out, leaving her wondering if the pain would ever ebb, or if it was the price of loving someone from a world that didn't bend. Meanwhile, Isaac plunged into his own abyss, the penthouse a vast, echoing tomb atop the city lights. The skyline stretched mockingly outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering empire that now felt like dust. He paced the marble floors in the dim glow of a single lamp, his reflection in the glass a haunted stranger, disheveled hair, shadowed eyes, the sharp suit abandoned for rumpled clothes that hung like regret. The confrontation with his father replayed endlessly, but worse was the silence from Emma, the void where her messages used to light up his phone. He'd tried reaching out only to hit walls, her absence a deafening roar that amplified his isolation. Power, money, the tools that had conquered boardrooms meant nothing here. He sank onto the couch, head in hands, the weight of it all pressing like a vice. Fatigue clawed at him, nights blending into days of skipped meals and restless stares at the ceiling. Thoughts of Emma consumed him, her easy warmth in the hospital, the spark in her eyes during their spars, the tenderness of that first kiss. He realized, with a gut-wrenching clarity, that he loved her, not as a diversion, but deeply, irrevocably, more than he'd ever allowed himself to feel. The helplessness gnawed, a torment that stripped away his arrogance layer by layer. How had he let his world hurt her? His father's check, the tabloid glare, it was all an extension of him, the man who'd chased success at the cost of soul. Money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't command her back. In the quiet hours, as dawn crept in, an epiphany dawned. True change demanded sacrifice, not control. He had to shed the ego that solved problems with checks and commands, to prove himself through actions that cost him, that humbled him. Determination flickered amid the regret, a spark in the darkness. He couldn't lose her, not without fighting the only way that mattered, by becoming a man worthy of her trust. The path ahead loomed steep, but for the first time, the hollow chase of ambition felt empty compared to the promise of something real. Isaac McCall sat alone in his penthouse, the city's skyline sprawling before him like a map of his old victories, now cold and meaningless. The weight of his father's ultimatum and Emma's absence pressed harder each day, a relentless ache that no boardroom triumph could soothe. His mind kept circling back to her steady hands in the garden, the way her laugh had warmed even his darkest corners. He'd learned, through a discreet inquiry, that her grandmother faced a costly eye surgery, one that could restore the sight fading from years of strain. The news hit him like a lifeline, a chance to act. But he knew throwing money at it like his father would was no answer. Emma deserved more than a transaction. She deserved proof of a change he was only beginning to understand. He spent nights poring over options, his desk littered with papers and coffee cups, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his tired face. The old Isaac would have written a check, called it charity, and moved on, expecting gratitude. But this time, he wrestled with himself, pacing the hardwood floors, haunted by the memory of his father's envelope on that coffee shop table. He couldn't repeat that mistake, couldn't let power taint this gesture. Instead, he dug into his personal wealth, not the McCall Empire's coffers, but his own, earned through years of relentless work. It was a quiet sacrifice, one that stung with its secrecy, but felt right in a way nothing had before. In the early hours, when the city slept, Isaac crafted a plan. He contacted a local hospital, the same one where he'd met Emma, and proposed a foundation, a fund for vision-saving surgeries, starting with those who couldn't afford them, like her grandmother. He insisted on anonymity, no press releases, no McCall names splashed across headlines. The paperwork was signed in a dimly lit office, his signature a whisper of intent rather than a shout for recognition. He imagined Emma's grandmother seeing her garden again, the roses she loved blooming in focus, and the thought brought a flicker of warmth to the hollow in his chest. It wasn't about winning Emma back, it was about doing something good, something that echoed the simplicity she lived by. Days later, the hospital staff began reaching out to patients, including Emma's grandmother, offering free procedures through the new fund. Isaac didn't linger to watch the outcome, didn't call Emma to claim credit. He sat in his quiet apartment, the city humming below, and felt a shift within, a shedding of the arrogance that had once defined him. This act, small in the scope of his wealth but vast in its intent, was his first step toward a different kind of strength, one not measured by control or conquest. The loneliness still gnawed, but it was softer now, tempered by the knowledge that he'd honored Emma's world in a way she might never know, but that mattered all the same. Emma, meanwhile, went about her days unaware, tending to her grandmother with a heavy heart, the pain of their separation a constant undertow. She noticed her grandmother's brighter mood, the hospital's unexpected call about a free surgery, stirring hope she didn't dare question. In the garden, as she pruned marigolds under a fading sun, a quiet resolve grew. She'd keep moving forward, carrying her strength as she always had. Yet somewhere, deep inside, a spark of curiosity flickered, a sense that the world might still hold surprises, ones that could bridge even the widest divides. For Isaac, that spark was a beacon, guiding him through the dark toward a redemption he was only beginning to earn. The storm clouds gathered thicker over Isaac's world, the city below his penthouse a distant blur as he wrestled with the changes stirring inside him. The silent act of setting up the foundation for surgeries like Emma's grandmother's had brought a quiet shift, a sense of purpose that didn't come from closing deals or commanding rooms. But Richard McCall wasn't one to let silence linger. His anger simmered like a pot left too long on the stove, fueled by Isaac's growing distance. The missed meetings, the evasive calls, the way his son seemed to slip from the grip of the empire he'd molded him for. Richard saw it as betrayal, a crack in the legacy, and he decided it was time to force a reckoning. The summons came via a terse email, pulling Isaac back to the family estate on a crisp afternoon, the drive winding through manicured lawns that felt more like barriers than beauty. He arrived with a knot in his stomach, the grand doors swinging open to reveal Richard in his study, the air heavy with the scent of aged whiskey and polished wood. His father stood by the fireplace, papers spread across the desk like battle plans, his face etched with that familiar mix of disappointment and steel. No greetings, just a direct plunge into the heart of it. News of an impending press conference, the kind that would echo through financial headlines. A massive merger was set to be announced, one that would fuse their cybersecurity giant with a rival powerhouse, swelling the McCall fortune and influence to new heights. But Richard saved the sharpest blade for last. As Isaac stood there, hands in pockets to hide their tremble, his father unveiled the full picture. At the event, Isaac's fiancée would be introduced to the world, a poised heiress from a family of equal stature, her name already whispered in elite circles. It was a match made in boardrooms, not hearts, a strategic union to seal alliances and fortify the empire against rivals. Richard's voice, steady and unyielding, laid it out like a contract clause. This was the path forward, the price of their shared blood. Choose the family legacy, or walk away from it all. The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and final, his father's eyes boring into him, searching for the son he'd raised to prioritize power over whims. Isaac felt the ground tilt, the room spinning with the weight of it. This wasn't just about business. It was a chain around his future, a dismissal of the man he'd glimpsed in Emma's garden, the one who craved peace over conquest. Memories flashed, her hand in the dirt, her quiet strength, and clashed against this cold orchestration. His father's plan stripped away choice, turning love into a liability, a distraction to be quashed. The ache in his chest deepened, a mix of fury and sorrow as he realized how deeply entwined he was in this web, how his silence had invited this blow. He left the estate with heavy steps, the ultimatum echoing like a closing door, forcing him to confront the fork in his road, cling to the throne he'd been groomed for, or risk it all for a life that felt truly his. The city lights flickered on as he drove away, a glittering reminder of what hung in the balance, and for the first time, the empire's shine paled against the warmth he longed to reclaim. The press conference buzzed with anticipation, the grand ballroom of the McCall Tower packed with reporters, flashing cameras, and the low murmur of speculation. Sleek banners announced the merger, a colossal deal that would reshape the cybersecurity landscape, merging empires and fortunes under the McCall name. Richard stood at the podium's edge, his silver hair catching the spotlights, his posture a pillar of unyielding confidence. Investors mingled with executives, glasses clinking in premature celebration, while the air hummed with the scent of fresh coffee and crisp suits. Isaac's arrival was unannounced, slipping through a side door like a shadow, his face calm but etched with a resolve that turned heads. Whispers rippled as he moved through the crowd, his father's eyes narrowing in surprise, the room's energy shifting from excitement to tension. Richard's jaw tightened, a flicker of alarm crossing his features. He'd expected compliance, not this quiet storm. Isaac mounted the steps to the stage, his steps measured, the weight of every eye upon him feeling like the final push toward a precipice he'd chosen. No fanfare, just a man stepping into the light, ready to shatter the facade. As Isaac reached the podium, the murmurs swelled into a hush, cameras clicking like frantic heartbeats. Richard moved to intercept, his hand outstretched in a gesture that masked control as concern. But Isaac sidestepped with polite firmness, taking the microphone as if it were his alone. The room held its breath, the spotlights hot on his skin, illuminating the subtle lines of exhaustion and determination around his eyes. He glanced at his father, a silent acknowledgement of the empire they'd built together, now a cage he needed to break. The merger, he began, his voice steady and clear, was off the table, from him at least. Gasps echoed, phones buzzing as live feeds captured the moment. He spoke of stepping down from his role, relinquishing the reins of the family conglomerate, his words landing like stones in still water, rippling shock through the audience. Richard's face paled, his fists clenching at his sides, the betrayal raw and public. Isaac didn't lash out. His tone was respectful, almost sorrowful, but unyielding. A son honoring the past while claiming his future. In that charged silence, Isaac's speech unfolded, short but piercing, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won insight. He talked of chasing profits that never filled the void, of boardrooms that echoed with emptiness, realizing too late that the greatest return wasn't on balance sheets, but in the quiet peace of the soul. The audience leaned in, some nodding in quiet agreement, others stunned by the vulnerability from a man known for ironclad deals. He shared a glimpse of his awakening, the hollow pursuit of power that had cost him connections, the way ambition had blinded him to what truly mattered. Cameras zoomed, capturing the emotion in his eyes, the subtle tremble in his hands as he defied not just his father, but the world they'd ruled. Richard stepped forward, his expression thunderous, whispering urgently. But Isaac held firm, his gaze sweeping the room, landing briefly on imagined faces like Emma's, fueling his resolve. This was his sacrifice, laying down the crown to prove he could change, that love and integrity outweighed legacy. The room erupted as he finished, questions flying, flashes blinding. But Isaac stepped back, the podium empty, his defiance a quiet roar that shattered the old order. Richard stood frozen, the empire's facade cracking, as his son walked away, free at last. The cost immense, but the path clear. The fallout from Isaac's stand rippled through the financial world like a stone skipped across a still pond, waves growing wider and wilder with each passing hour. Stock prices for the McCall conglomerate dipped sharply that afternoon, screens and trading floors flashing red as investors scrambled, whispers turning to shouts about instability at the top. The merger, once a sure thing, unraveled in the public eye, partners pulling back amid the drama of a family empire cracking at its seams. News outlets feasted on the story, headlines blaring about the prodigal son's rebellion, painting Richard as the architect of a cold, calculated dynasty where even love was a commodity. Richard's reputation, once an untouchable fortress in boardrooms and elite clubs, crumbled under the scrutiny. Whispers spread like wildfire, how he'd orchestrated a marriage for mergers, treating his son like a pawn in a high-stakes game of chess. Business allies distanced themselves, invitations to galas drying up, old friends offering polite regrets over lunches that never happened. The man who'd wielded power like a scepter now faced the sting of isolation, his phone silent, his office echoing with the absence of deference. It was a downfall not of bankruptcy, but of prestige, the kind that hit hardest in circles where image was currency. People talked in hushed tones at country clubs, shaking their heads at the arrogance of using family ties for financial gain. The exposure leaving Richard exposed, diminished. A king dethroned by his own hand. Isaac watched it unfold from a quiet corner of the city, a modest cafe far from the tower's glare, his phone buzzing with alerts, but his heart strangely light. He'd lost the reins of the empire, the boardroom throne, the perks that once defined him. Private jets grounded, accounts frozen in the family rift. Yet in that loss bloomed a freedom he'd never known. Like shedding a heavy coat on a warm day, the air felt clearer, his steps unburdened by expectations that had chained him since boyhood. He thought of Emma, her simple garden, the way she'd taught him that strength wasn't in control, but in quiet choices. The pain of their separation lingered, a dull ache, but this unraveling felt like justice. Not vengeance, but balance. The universe righting a tilt he'd long ignored. In the quiet satisfaction of it all, Isaac sipped his coffee, the steam rising like a sigh of release. Richard's fall wasn't something he celebrated outright, but it eased the knots in his chest, a vicarious reckoning that whispered of second chances. The world kept turning. Stocks would rebound for others. But for Isaac, this was the dawn of something new, unscripted, unarmored, and finally, his own. The city hummed on, indifferent, but in his heart a calm settled, promising paths untaken and horizons wide open. Emma sat in her grandmother's garden, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the worn wooden bench. The press conference replayed in her mind, Isaac's words echoing like a distant thunder, his quiet defiance, stepping away from the empire that had defined him. She'd watched it on her phone, heart pounding, seeing the man she'd known in the hospital emerge fully, vulnerable yet strong. Then came the nurse's call about the anonymous fund covering her grandmother's surgery, a puzzle piece that clicked into place when she pieced together the timing. It wasn't coincidence. It was Isaac, quiet and selfless, a far cry from the world of checks and control she'd fled. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, soft and deliberate, and looked up to see him standing there, not in a suit, but simple jeans and a shirt, his hands in his pockets, eyes carrying the weight of his choices. The garden felt smaller with him in it, the air charged with unspoken history, their laughs, the kiss, the hurt. He didn't rush, just approached slowly, sitting at the bench's edge with a humility that softened his edges. The birds chirped overhead, a gentle backdrop to the moment, as he began, his voice low and steady, not demanding, but offering. He spoke of the emptiness he'd chased, the arrogance that had blinded him, how her warmth had cracked open a life he'd thought unbreakable. No grand promises, just honesty. The pain of losing her. The epiphany that love wasn't a transaction but a quiet build, day by day. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He laid bare his heart, saying he'd spend his life proving he was worthy, if she'd let him try. Emma's chest tightened, tears pricking as she saw the change, not in words but in the man before her, stripped of power, just Isaac, raw and real. She reached out, her hand finding his, the touch electric yet soothing, like coming home. Forgiveness flowed not from pity, but from seeing his journey mirror her own resilience, the way he'd chosen heart over empire, echoing the strength she'd always held. A smile broke through her tears, warm and genuine, as she leaned in, their foreheads touching in silent understanding. The garden wrapped around them, the scent of earth and blooms a promise of new growth, their bond reforged stronger, a partnership earned through fire. In that quiet union the world felt right, two souls aligned in a love that had weathered the storm. 2 years slipped by like a gentle breeze, and the house they now called home hummed with the warmth of a life built from choice, not chance. A modest craftsman cottage, its walls painted soft blue, stood nestled in a quiet neighborhood, where marigolds bloomed in a nod to Emma's grandmother's garden. Inside, the wooden floor creaked under the patter of tiny feet, a little girl with golden curls, her cries echoing through the air as she stumbled while chasing a ray of sunlight. Isaac scooped her up, his touch tender, the once steely billionaire now softened by fatherhood, his laughter low and warm as he dusted off her knees. The room smelled of fresh bread and coffee, a Sunday morning ritual that grounded their days. Emma moved through the kitchen, her hair tied back, her hands deft as she sorted papers for their small cybersecurity firm. It wasn't the towering empire Isaac once ruled, but a venture rooted in purpose, protecting data for nonprofits, shielding the vulnerable from digital shadows. She'd become his partner in every sense, her sharp mind and quiet strength steering their shared vision. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, a reflection of the values they'd fought for. Their daughter's crayons littered the table, bright scribbles beside spreadsheets, a blend of chaos and love that felt like home. Outside, sunlight spilled through the open windows, catching the simple gold band on Emma's finger as she paused to watch Isaac play with their girl, tickling her until she squealed. The scars of their past, the tabloids, the ultimatums, the collapse of old empires had faded, softened by time and trust. Isaac had shed the weight of his father's legacy, finding freedom in this smaller life, where success was measured in moments, not millions. Emma, too, had grown, her resilience now a quiet pride, a woman who'd faced a world that tried to diminish her and emerged stronger, loved. As evening settled, they gathered on the porch, the little girl nestled between them, her curls catching the last light. The air carried the scent of jasmine, a reminder of the garden where their story took root. Isaac's hand found Emma's, their fingers interlocking with an ease born of years, his gaze holding hers with a depth that spoke of battles won together. This was their power, not in wealth or status, but in a love that endured, a family built on mutual respect. The world beyond their porch spun on, but here, in the laughter and quiet glances, they'd crafted a happiness that was theirs alone, steady and whole.